online, on Facebook and on iTunes.
You're watching Europe and You.
On the programme this time.
Why a Yorkshire power station says it needs the EU to help it go green.
In the studio, what lies beneath? The battle over rules for the deep sea.
And the new social network hoping to take Europe by storm.
Bristol in the southwest of England has been crowned European Green Capital for 2015. The news was announced by the EU's Environment Commissioner at a ceremony in the French city of Nantes, the current holder of the prize.
Bristol Mayor George Ferguson was there to collect the award. When he led his bid team to Brussels in May, he shared with us some of the secrets of Bristol's environmental success.
Well, we're undoubtedly UK's greenest city, and I think we're building on the energy front, on the transport front, on the air quality front, health, on children, and making it a good city for children, which makes it a good city for us all. And I think all those messages got across. And I think we are a truly European city, and I think that got across to them, that we mean to share this.
South West MEP Graham Watson was also part of Bristol's pitch. He thinks people power has been key to the city's winning formula.
I think it's the sheer power of the work done by over 250 local organisations or groups of people, concerned citizens, coming together to make Bristol a better place to live. And I think that the combined impact of that over a number of years has made Bristol something very, very special.
Britain's biggest power station has warned that plans to go green are being held up by Europe. Drax in North Yorkshire has traditionally been coal-powered, but the idea is to run half of the plant on biomass by 2016 to reduce carbon emissions.
That will involve generating power by burning plant materials, such as wood, instead. But Head of Environment Nigel Burdett told us that EU delays in setting standards for biomass are holding them back.
It's just causing uncertainty, it's causing us difficulty in getting relationships with stakeholders, it's getting difficult relationships with financial institutions that want to loan us money. We need that certainty of the benchmark so that we know exactly what is a good biomass and the material that we can take and the material which is clearly going to have stakeholder problems.
A group from Drax has been out in Brussels to try to get some answers. Yorkshire MEP Timothy Kirkhope is also taking up the issue.
The demand is there on the one hand, but the conditions and criteria are not in place on the other. That's an unreasonable situation for a major employer and a major investor like Drax. So they've got to have some kind of certainty as soon as possible. And they're here in Europe talking to people like myself, the legislators, but also talking to the Commission to try and get a move on.
Still to come. The EU's multi-million-pound cheque for science in Swansea.
And the social network that's getting MEPs clicking.
Pop down to your local fish and chip shop and chances are you're not going to be ordering the likes of one of these. But there are fishermen who are catching so-called deep-sea fish. Now the EU is considering a new law to regulate the industry. The question is, what should it contain? Two people with very different points of view join me now. Barry Dees from the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations and Claire Nouvin from the environmental group Bloom. I hope I pronounced your name right there, Claire, more or less. I'd like to start with you. If you could just explain, before we get into the pros and cons, what is deep sea fishing?
Well, in a nutshell, it's because we've overfished, in the 1980s, we've overfished the accessible fish stocks. We went deeper and deeper to look for new fish, fish resources. And so we went down to areas which were almost 2,000 meters of depth. And we've targeted fish such as orange roughy that was actually quite tasty. So we've remembered that one quite well. And in 2010, we've closed the orange roughy fishery. So now it's more black scabbard fish and round-nosed grenadier type of fish, blueling also.
I mean, these are probably fish that ordinary people have probably not heard of, people that go to their, as I mentioned, their fish and chip shop. Why, Barry, is it necessary to go after these fish? Are they valuable for you as an industry?
Oh, absolutely. These are high value, high quality fish for which there's a demand. And I don't think it's quite true to say that the exploration of deep water fisheries was just a response to pressure on other stocks. I think that's part of the picture, a little bit more complicated than that. Most of the fishing for deep water species takes place on the continental slope, so we're already fishing on the top. It's actually the slope area in the European context. And there's a significant number of international fleets fish for these stocks.
And what kind of fish, what happens to this fish? Is this the kind of fish that we see on our plates? We just are not kind of commonly aware, commonly know about the names.
If you go into restaurants in Brussels, you will find black scabbard fish, highly valued, very, very nice fish.
When it comes down to it, what are your concerns about this type of fishing?
Well, actually, Barry looks like a very nice person, but we are going to disagree on a certain amount of things, it seems. I don't tend to think that they're very good fish, and they're not very high value. They're only 1% of the catch overall, for example, in France, and in the EU, it's just about more than 1%. So you're going to have
worth more than 100 million euros nonetheless. It might be only a small proportion.
1% of the catch is really, really tiny. That means that as a consumer, you're not going to find them that easily. In France, it takes quite some effort to actually look for the fish in the supermarkets. You only find them in the supermarkets. In France, you won't find them on the menu in a restaurant.
Let's be clear, what are your concerns, though, about this type of fishing?
And so the concerns are that there's certain ways you can catch those fish. One of those ways is called a mixed fishery. It's a bottom trawl fishery. It's a big net. It's weighted, so you've got weights which actually you can drag it on the seafloor. So of course, it's not rocket science to understand that if you drag a big net on the seafloor, it's going to do some damage. And yes, you can have some damage. Maybe some level of damage is acceptable if you want to go and catch food, and why not? The problem is that the deep sea is a really different environment. It's basically in the slow lane. And these animals, most of them, live longer than our grandmothers, basically. So we really have to catch them and to go about actually exploiting these areas with a lot of caution.
Would you accept that there are some serious environmental concerns because of this style of fishing that happens in the deep sea?
Yes, I don't think we're going to find much to disagree on in terms of the objectives here. We're talking about slow-growing species that need special protection, that need a very low level of exploitation. And we're also talking in the context of marine ecosystems in which there are very vulnerable habitats. So I think an especially careful approach is absolutely appropriate in these fisheries.
And given what you're saying, we have already had European Commission proposals. The discussions are now underway in the European Parliament. They're calling for a very safe approach, aren't they? More safeguards. What do you make of what's been suggested?
I think really with this proposal, the Commission have harked back to the old way of doing things, a blanket approach. And with blanket approaches, you tend to get a lot of unintended consequences. There are a number of tools available, the quotas, protecting marine areas in terms of closure of those areas, selectivity. There's a number of different approaches that can be applied. Our problem with the proposal is the prohibition, what would amount to a prohibition on deep water trawling and on deep water gill nets. That's the issue.
The thing with bottom trawling is that in the deep sea, because the deep sea is so fragile, it's been recognized as really just not the way forward, and there's overwhelming scientific evidence that it just doesn't fly with the deep sea environment.
Claire says that there's plenty of scientific data that overwhelmingly suggests that there's a need for better environmental protection.
Well, that's not what the scientists say. Many of these fisheries are data deficient, and I think part of the approach that we would be advocating is developing a collaborative approach in which our informed understanding of these fisheries are built and the targeted management measures are based on that. There are alternatives. There are alternatives throughout the world based on best practice that we can use here. It's just the ban. A blanket ban is just over the top.
Just briefly from each of you then, as things stand, what do you make of the EU proposals? Where would you like them to be improved before we come to a final vote? First of you, Claire.
Well, the thing is, I have a hard time disconnecting the economic performance of these fisheries, from the ecological issues, which are, really just, as you said, not debated anymore. And the problem is that we've looked at the French case, because that's the one we know best, and the French big trawlers, the one that operate in Scottish waters and UK waters, are the ones that are going to be most affected by the European Commission proposal. And it turns out that these very few vessels are actually totally underperforming. I mean, they are chronically loss-making and they're subsidized. And so that's where I really have a hard time. I'm like, why should we be funding, the destruction of the most vulnerable marine habitats if it doesn't create value for the economy, but it's a drain on society?
Just if you can react to that.
I'm not arguing in favour of subsidies. Subsidies are on their way out.
But is this a loss-making industry anyway for the likes of Scottish trawlers that are going after this kind of fish?
What's the problem then? Because if they can't make money, they're not going to be there. It's a commercial fishery, and that just stands to reason. No, the issue is deeper than that. It's about using a very heavy-handed approach to crack a nut when there are viable alternatives available. And I'm sure as this process moves forward and member states come in and have their say, that a compromise will be reached. But I think it'll be quite different. The outcome will be quite different from the proposal.
Well, there's going to be arguments still to come, but we're going to have to leave it there. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining me.
More lorries than necessary are being forced onto Britain's roads because of high charges for using the Channel Tunnel. That's according to a local MEP. The European Commission has asked the government to intervene to bring down the price for rail operators using the cross-channel link.
The company responsible, Eurotunnel, points out that building the line between England and France was entirely paid for by private investment. That £15 billion bill is still being paid off.
But Conservative MEP Richard Ashworth believes if the costs were less, more freight would go by rail rather than road. And he thinks it would also encourage other companies besides Eurostar to run passenger services to the continent.
Firstly, travel through the Channel Tunnel for foot passengers is more expensive than it ought to be. And secondly, freight is prohibitively expensive. That means too many lorries going through the county of Kent in particular, when much of that freight ought to be going by rail. There is 43% capacity in the Channel Tunnel, which is not being used up at present.
A new Welsh university campus, made possible with European funding, has been given an official launch in Brussels. Building work started on Swansea's cutting-edge scientific research facility in May and is set for completion in 2015.
£60 million is being ploughed into the project by the European Investment Bank, plus £50 million more from other EU sources and the Welsh Government. Vice-Chancellor Richard Davies says the European cash has been crucial and EU finance bosses are impressed with how it's being spent.
The assessment of the European Investment Bank and the European Commission is this is the best project they've seen led by a university in the whole of Europe. It's based on world-class engineering and science, but working with the top companies.
Welsh Labour MEP Derek Vaughan hosted the launch event. He says it shows why Wales needs EU support.
EU funding is vital for Wales. Over the current period, Wales will probably get around £2.5 billion worth of structural funds. But in addition to that, there are many other pots of money coming to Wales from the European Union. And I know right across Wales, there are many projects just wouldn't take place without the EU funding. Many infrastructure projects, many town centre developments, many skills training schemes are all funded by the European Union. And this Swansea campus is just another example of that.
A new social network to challenge the likes of Facebook and Twitter has been launched by two entrepreneurs from Coventry. The group behind Vote My Link chose the European Parliament to profile their site, which allows users to give their like or dislike to links on the internet. West Midlands MEP Phil Bennion is already hooked.
You can score the links that you look at, and of course the higher the score they get, the higher they rise in their profile rises, so people can actually see where there's a link that's very, very popular and well received. So I think this is going to be very, very interesting to politicians, bloggers, activists of all kinds, and the general public, I think, as well.
We have this lack of knowledge of what the MEPs stand for, and it would be an ideal platform to be able to gauge with the different MEPs of what they stand for, why they're there, why they're representing us, and to be involved more into the current policies that are taking place.
Co-founder Beverly Eve has been heartened by the response so far, with a range of UK MEPs already clicking online.
We've had a really positive response. We've had MEPs asking when they can create their groups. They're interested in how they can engage more with members of the public, how members of the public can inform them about their ideas and the content that they're reading and creating, and to have that ranked in a group basis. They're very keen on the ideas, the response we've had.
There are lots of ways you can keep up to date with Europe and You. We're on Facebook, on Twitter, and you can download our app from iTunes.
But that's all from this edition of Europe and You. We'll see you again soon. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Less than a year to go before the next European elections, but how do you get people to go out and vote? That's next time on Europe and You.